Understanding dementia, the brain and dementia. Healthy human brains have billions of brain cells or neurons that communicate with each other through neural pathways, a bit like long arms and legs that reach out to each other. Everything we think, say, and do is a product of our brain cells communicating with each other. So, how does dementia affect the brain? With Alzheimer's disease, the brain cells are no longer able to communicate with each other because amyloid protein deposits clump together and over time become amyloid plaques. These plaques build up between the cells, causing a barrier in communication pathways. As mentioned, there's also a problem with a second type of protein. When tau protein malfunctions, it causes the scaffolding of the cell itself to collapse, which causes tangles to form. When this happens, neurons lose their ability to function and eventually die. With vascular dementia, brain cells eventually shrink and die because the important oxygen, nutrients, and glucose that are transported through our blood are cut off. Kind of like a plant that doesn't get enough water, the brain cells will eventually shrink and die. Blood supply can be cut off when an artery, vessel, or capillary is clogged, or if it bursts, like when someone is experiencing a hemorrhage. Lewy bodies are abnormal protein deposits that build up inside the brain cells. Like with Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, the abnormal proteins will cause the brain cells to stop working properly and eventually also cause the brain cell to shrink and die, once again causing a disruption in the neural pathway. While there are several different diseases that cause dementia, they eventually become quite similar in their symptoms. Eventually, they lead to pronounced shrinking of the brain, or atrophy. This image demonstrates what the brain of someone with very advanced Alzheimer's disease would look like. Although this is not a very pleasant image to look at or discuss, it is important that we understand and recognize that there is a disease happening in the person's brain that is causing their symptoms. Oftentimes, a person with dementia looks quite healthy, maybe even normal on the outside, which makes it difficult for caregivers, family members, and friends to make sense of their symptoms. And in fact, we hear from people living with dementia that this is one of the most difficult reactions that they receive. What do you mean you have dementia? You look fine. This image can help us work through our understanding by reminding us that the person with dementia's brain is changing in size, weight, and volume. They are not in control of their symptoms, and the normal pathways of communication between brain cells have permanently changed. They are not doing things on purpose. So what do you notice when you look at the two sides of the brain in this image? The first is what we call global atrophy. The brain, the healthy brain on the left-hand side, is much bigger. There are more brain cells, and on the right, the brain cells have died and the brain itself has shrunk. The second thing that we notice is enlarged ventricles. That are naturally fluid-filled spaces in the brain. They exist in all of our brains, but as dementia progresses and brain cells die, those ventricles get larger. A very important thing to notice, particularly with Alzheimer's, but also other forms of dementia, is that the hippocampus, which is the area circled here, in a healthy human brain, it's about the size of a walnut, and that's the part of our brain that is involved with short-term memory processing. It is essentially the part of the brain, I think of it as the part of the brain that writes down memories, and it's that writing down that turns the memory into a long-term memory. On the right-hand side, you can see how profoundly shrunken it is in someone with advanced Alzheimer's. This means that that part of the brain no longer captures long-term memories or captures them very intermittently. This is very important to remember because it helps when dealing with either yourself as someone with dementia or if you are caring for someone with dementia. When someone says, "I don't remember," or "that didn't happen," it doesn't matter how many times you try to cue them because their brain has not written it down. If our brains don't write it down, it didn't happen. So if you are the person living with dementia, does this image help you understand some of the changes that you have experienced? If you're caring for someone living with dementia, does this image help you understand why the person you are caring for has changed? These next two slides will hopefully help you understand and make sense of some of the symptoms that you are seeing or experiencing, or that you might see or experience in the future. We're going to look in very basic terms at some of the key functions of specific areas of the brain and what changes you might see with damage to these different regions. You might want to watch the Alzheimer's Society of Canada's interactive brain tour, which allows you to explore each of these concepts in more detail. In the helpful resources link below this video is a link to the brain tour, which is braintour.alzheimer.ca. The occipital lobe processes vision and gives us the ability to see and combine colors, shapes, angles, and movements into meaningful patterns. Damage to this part of the brain may result in perceptual difficulties, loss of depth perception, changes to peripheral or up and down vision, and an inability to see or judge movement, which of course is very important for driving because it allows us to judge how far away is that car from me? How fast is that car moving towards me? The parietal lobe allows us to put activities into a sequence, such as putting clothes on in the right order, using tools, or performing tasks that require a logical sequence, such as starting and driving a car. These parts of the brain control our ability to understand spatial information, such as where we are in a specific environment and where other objects are. Wernicke's area, which is responsible for understanding speech, is located bordering both the parietal and temporal lobe for most people on the left side of the brain. So damage to the parietal lobes can result in symptoms that vary depending on whether the right or left side of the brain is affected and which is your dominant side. But changes might include difficulty in understanding what people say, an inability to express thoughts clearly in writing, difficulty handling bank accounts or paying bills. A person may experience changes in wayfinding and get lost easily. They may experience difficulty putting on clothes or tying shoes, and they may have balance and gait difficulties. The temporal lobes sit on either side of our heads, sort of in beside the tops of our ears. They are most commonly associated with processing auditory information, sounds. and are involved with encoding memories. The temporal lobes are also believed to play an important role in the processing of affect or emotions, of language, and certain aspects of visual perception. In addition, the dominant temporal lobe, which for most people is the left side, is involved in understanding language and learning and remembering verbal information. The other non-dominant lobe is involved in learning and remembering nonverbal information, for example, visuospatial material and music. So damage to these parts of the brain can result in an inability to retain memory of the recent past, which can result in living wholly in the present moment. There may be a loss of vocabulary, and someone may develop an inability to recognize familiar faces, objects, or places. The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that initiates activity and lets us plan and organize our actions. This part of the brain enables us to look ahead in time, to schedule tasks and devise ways to achieve goals. It regulates our social judgment and behavior, such as knowing what behavior is appropriate to a situation, interpreting the feelings of other people, and monitoring our own actions. The frontal lobe gives us attention, focus, and concentration, and is responsible for complex thinking and problem solving. When there is damage here, the person may appear apathetic or uninterested. They may have difficulty focusing or maintaining their concentration. You may notice that people stop engaging in their hobbies or other activities that they previously enjoyed, or that they quickly lose interest in an activity and seem content to sit without responding to others. A person may withdraw from others. Other changes that might happen due to damage in the frontal lobe would be inappropriateness, whether verbal, physical, or sexual, or they may be unable to stop an activity, repeating it over and over. Deep inside the brain is the limbic system, which is involved with memory and emotion. It can be helpful to think of the limbic system as our emotional brain. The limbic system helps us generate emotions. The cortex, the thinking brain, allows us to think about and respond to our emotions. The limbic system links the lobes of the brain, enabling them to connect behavior with memories. It controls emotion and basic needs, such as sleeping and eating. And it maintains our circadian rhythm, which is our sleep-wake cycle. This part is affected very early in Alzheimer's disease. People with damage to the limbic system may have difficulty finding objects and remembering where they were placed. They may be suspicious and prone to quickly changing emotions, irritability, depression, or anxiety. A key part of the limbic system is the hippocampus. As mentioned earlier, this is our short-term memory processing center. It's where verbal and visual memories are processed. Verbal memories are words, memories related to what we read or say or hear. Visual memory lets us recognize objects, faces, and places to guide us around our environment. This hippocampus is essentially the part of the brain that writes things down as part of turning memories from short-term to long-term. This is one of the earliest areas affected with Alzheimer's disease, and so if there is damage to the hippocampus, things don't get written down. When someone with Alzheimer's disease says that they haven't seen you in weeks, even though you had dinner together the previous night, it isn't helpful to try to get them to remember the dinner together by cueing them. We would normally say things like, well, I was just there last night. You remember, you made that wonderful roast beef that you do, and we laughed about how I can never get my roast to taste the same way. Don't you remember? That isn't helpful because in the case of a person with Alzheimer's disease or with damage to the hippocampus, the memory never got written down. That is, it never got encoded in the brain's long-term memory, and so cueing doesn't work because there is no memory there to recall. It would be as frustrating as if someone insisted that you were a famous author with many books to your name when you know that is not the case. Below this video, you can find a link to a downloadable document that itself contains links to a number of helpful resources, including print resources that you can download. And of course, the Alzheimer's Society website at alzheimerbc.org contains a wealth of information. And if you have questions about information you've heard here or any other questions about living with dementia, please don't hesitate to call our First Link Dementia Helpline. English services are available Monday to Friday between 9 a.m. and 8 p.m.